Hi, I'm Eric Hansen. I'm the music director and conductor of the orchestra. Welcome. If you're a returning audience member, welcome back. If you are a newbie, welcome. I hope you enjoy yourself this afternoon. We have a wonderful program for you. This is in the middle of the season for us, the third of 5 concerts. And I talked for a few minutes before the concert about the pieces in not a lot of depth, but give you some insight into the composers. And I also speak very, very briefly before each of the pieces as well. So we have 2 pieces on the program, 2 pieces on the program by composers who are early Romantic era and later Romantic era. In other words, Felix Mendelssohn was composing and performing as a not only very fine pianist, but a conductor, excellent conductor, from the 1820s through to his death in the late 1840s. And Antonín Dvořák was pretty much the second half of the century, composing in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And he actually visited the United States and conducted briefly the New York Philharmonic in the early years of the 20th century. So the pieces, of course, are very, very different, not only because they're from different eras and different composers, but one of them is a violin concerto, of course, and the other is a symphony. And for those of you who came to our first 2 concerts, especially the last concert where we performed 2 complete symphonies by very different composers, and then did a portion of the 3rd symphony that was actually by Mendelssohn when he was 12 years old. He was a prodigy, I guess you would have to say, really in keeping with Mozart. He was not as prolific as Mozart, but just about nobody was as prolific as Mozart. Mozart composed over 650 works, and that was pretty much in about 25 years' time. And that was before printers. But back to Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn, I mentioned, was not only a very fine composer. There were several symphonies. There's quite a bit of chamber music, and there are more than a few concertos, especially piano. There are 2 violin concertos. This is the one that's the famous one, the E minor. And I'm a violinist, and I studied it when I was young, a lot younger, I should say. And it's one easily, I'm silly to say this because I don't like top 10 lists, but it's definitely a top 10 violin concerto, not only for violinists, but for audiences, because it's so spectacular. It has a uniqueness to it. It's very different than Mozart's or Beethoven's violin concertos, or Haydn for that matter, in that it's more in keeping with like late 19th century what's called tone poems, which are standalone movements for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour long by, say, Richard Strauss. And Dvořák composed a few tone poems as well. And there's kind of a backstory to them, which means the music is pretty much continuous. And you're going to have tempo changes throughout, faster and slower tempo, but without start and stop like you do in typical symphonies, where there's a first movement and it comes to conclusion, pause, second movement, pause, third movement. Excuse me, sorry. But violin concertos, since the time of Mozart, have been in 3-movement form, and this is as well, but it's very unique. So I thought I'd talk about the piece instead of talking a lot about Mendelssohn, although we did some very, very important things. And one I will mention before I talk about this piece is that there was something, a kind of a chronological occurrence that happened until we get to recordings and radio and TV. In other words, the last 100-something years, 120, 130 years. In that when a composer died, especially in the 17 and early 1800s, his music pretty much died with him or her. And what that means is the parts and the scores ended up in somebody's trunk somewhere, perhaps in a library or a museum or something. And one very important thing that Mendelssohn did was something like 70 years after the death of Bach, and everybody in Germany, everywhere else had pretty much forgotten about Bach, the great composer of the first half of the 18th century. Mendelssohn promoted his music, in manner of speaking, by conducting several of Bach's very important sacred works, one of them being St. Matthew Passion, which is kind of like a mass, but sung with soloists and orchestra. And it was revelatory to the folks at that time, because almost all the people who had been, of course, all the people who had been alive in Bach's lifetime, 1730s and 40s, were dead, 1830s. And as I said, there are no recordings, and people didn't really study scores back then, except for maybe composers. So Mendelssohn actually reinvigorated and brought Bach back to the masses, so to speak, a practice which I think a lot of other conductors started doing. He was a very fine conductor. So the piece we're doing is, as I mentioned at the outset, a very famous violin concerto. It's in a unique key. Most violin concertos, especially famous ones from the late 18th and 19th and even early 20th century, are in the key of D major. It's the so-called violin key where the instrument resonates properly, and there's better facility for violinists in the key of D major. It's hard to describe. E minor is an awkward key, so it's a little bit tricky to play in tune. Our solo is spectacular, so you won't notice any issues with that. But it has a pretty fluid and kind of connective form that I started mentioning a minute or two ago. And then the first movement, when it ends, which is pretty robust, and the violin ends up doing some pyrotechnics and arpeggios and quick runs, and the orchestra plays rather loud, so you expect the end of the movement, it just kind of keeps going. And you can hear, right after the orchestra stops, this big, large E major chord, and fiddle stops, violin stops playing. You're going to hear a quiet bassoon playing that gets quieter, and then we go right into the second movement. It segues immediately, which had never really happened before. It may not be a big deal, but it is. Sorry. And then at the end of the gorgeous second movement, there's just the slightest of pauses, and then Mendelssohn did so this kind of wonderful little interlude where the violin is accompanied by the strings, but rather quietly, and then launches into this really robust and exciting third movement. One of the techniques you're going to see that Mendelssohn used that a lot of other composers had not at that time was what's called up-bow spiccato. And you're going to hear Noelle play, and right at the beginning, and do and there's a passage where she does about 30 notes, all like this, seemingly not moving the bow, and it's called up-bow spiccato. It's very difficult to do. And I jokingly tell people that's really the equipment that makes all the mistakes and does all the great stuff, but it's her. So that's the first piece of the program. And then the Dvořák, who was a spectacular composer of romantic, as I mentioned, end of the 19th century. 9 symphonies, although most even members of the orchestra are just familiar with the last 3 or 4, from 6, 7, 8, 9, the New World Symphony. Probably most of you have heard it. It has a wonderful tune in it, which has been mistaken for an American folk song. In fact, Dvořák composed a song that sounded like an American folk song, which is very typical of some romantic era composers who we sometimes refer to not in a negative way, a political way, or militaristic, but as nationalist composers. So in a lot of Dvořák's music, especially the slow movement, which is the second movement of a 4-movement symphony, at least in the 19th century, usually has themes and melodies, 2 or 3, which are very folk-like, because he was a Bohemian composer from not too far from Prague, in the now Czechoslovakia. His music has kind of an Eastern European folk music flavor to it. The third movement is a scherzo, which means lively and quick, and it again has a very much a dance-like flavor to it. It's in 6/8 time. For those of you who know Beatles song Norwegian Wood, that goes bum 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 bum. We call it double waltz. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the scherzo is in 6/8 time. And now, for those of you who are either math challenged or not, one of the cool things that's very typical of Slovak 2 groups of 3 or 3 groups of 2. So you can hear the music go here. Da 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 da. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you get up and dance, you might have a little trouble. And be very, very careful because you don't want to fall down with the people in front of you. So the Dvořák is a wonderful piece. It's full orchestra and very dramatic, 4 movements, and I really hope you enjoy it. Enjoy the whole